After the passing of Carl Weathers in early 2024, his longtime home, a charming Spanish-style villa nestled in the Hollywood Hills, sat on the market longer than expected. Though well-maintained, prospective buyers reported an odd feeling upon entering, an almost electric presence in the air. Some dismissed it as the weight of history. After all, Weathers was a legend, and his home had been filled with decades of memories. Others weren't so sure. By late 2024, a young couple, Ethan and Rachel Lawson, purchased the house. Ethan was an up-and-coming screenwriter, and Rachel, a physical therapist, had always dreamed of living in Los Angeles. The house, with its arched doorways, warm terracotta floors, and stunning hillside views, seemed like a perfect place to start their new life. Their first night in the home was uneventful, save for the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. It wasn't until their second week that the strange occurrences began. Ethan, working late in his office one night, heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway. Assuming Rachel was awake, he called out, but no answer came. He walked to their bedroom, only to find her fast asleep. A chill ran down his spine. Rachel, too, experienced strange moments. While unpacking, she found one of Carl's old books still left behind on a shelf, the greatest boxing matches of all time. She placed it back, only to find it on the coffee table the next morning, open to a chapter about Rocky. One evening, while watching Predator, Ethan felt a presence behind him, as if someone were leaning in, watching the screen. When Jesse Ventura's famous line, "I ain't got time to bleed," echoed through the room, Ethan swore he heard a deep, amused chuckle somewhere nearby. Determined to understand what was happening, Rachel started researching Carl Weathers' life. She learned about his deep pride in his career, his love for storytelling, and how much he enjoyed mentoring young actors and filmmakers. Ethan, a writer still trying to make his mark in Hollywood, couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Carl hadn't quite left his old home behind. One night, Ethan decided to speak to whatever presence lingered. "Mr. Weathers," he said, standing in the dimly lit living room, "if you're here, just know we respect you. We love this house, and if you've got any wisdom for an aspiring screenwriter, I'm all ears." The room remained silent, but for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. From that night on, the disturbances lessened. But every so often, when Ethan struggles with his writing late at night, he swears he hears the faintest whisper near his desk. "Keep fighting." Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop casting long, shifting shadows across the walls of his office. The house was quiet. Rachel had gone to bed hours ago, but silence never truly felt like silence here. There was always something beneath it, a thickness in the air, like the weight of a held breath. He stared at the screen, the blinking cursor mocking him. The words wouldn't come, no matter how hard he tried to force them. His fingers hovered over the keys, motionless. A rejection email from a studio executive still sat open on his second monitor, the blunt phrasing lingering in his mind like an aftertaste. Asterisk, not quite what we're looking for. Try again in the future, asterisk. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. The room felt stuffy, the air dense with something he couldn't name. He pushed back his chair, standing to stretch, and as he did, the faintest whisper stirred the stillness of the room. "Keep fighting." It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was there. A breath of sound, a hint of a voice not entirely gone. Ethan froze, every nerve in his body tightening at once. His eyes darted around the room, but nothing was out of place. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation, his imagination, exhaustion, the wind slipping through a crack in the old wooden frame of the window. But the air was still. The night beyond the glass was windless. The city stretched below in a mosaic of golden light. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan turned back to his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keyboard. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath. Then he began to type. The words came easier than before. Not perfect, not effortless, but steady, as if something unseen had nudged him forward. Across the house, Rachel stirred in her sleep. She wasn't sure what had woken her. A feeling more than a sound, a shift in the air, an energy she could sense even with her eyes closed. She rolled over, blinking drowsily at the dim light filtering under the bedroom door. Ethan was still awake. She knew he would be. He always pushed himself too hard. Something felt different tonight. The house had always carried a presence, but this was subtler. Not oppressive. Just there. She pulled the covers up to her chin and listened. The soft clack of Ethan's keyboard echoed down the hall, steady and sure, and beneath it the faintest sound of something else. A deep, quiet chuckle. Warm, knowing. Then, nothing. The next morning, Ethan woke with the sensation that he had barely slept, though his body told a different story. He had written late into the night later than he intended, but instead of exhaustion, he felt a strange lightness, like he had broken through some invisible wall that had been holding him back. His laptop still sat open on the desk, the screen glowing faintly in the early morning light filtering through the blinds. The last sentence he had written lingered there, unfinished, as if waiting for him to return. Rachel was already in the kitchen when he stepped out of the bedroom, the scent of coffee thick in the air. She stood by the window, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug, gazing out at the hazy sprawl of Los Angeles below. "You were up late," she said without turning around. Ethan poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter. "Yeah, but I actually got some writing done." He took a sip, hesitated. I heard something last night." Rachel finally turned to face him, one eyebrow arched. "Something or someone?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "A voice. Just a whisper. I don't know. Maybe I imagined it." Rachel studied him for a long moment before setting her mug down on the counter. "I heard something too." Ethan stiffened. "When?" "While I was in bed. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but it was real." She hesitated. "It didn't feel threatening." He nodded slowly. "No, it hadn't. Whatever was in the house, if there was something, didn't feel malicious. It wasn't the kind of haunting that sent people running. If anything, it felt watchful, protective." Rachel exhaled through her nose, arms folding across her chest. "I think Carl Weathers is still here." Ethan let out a breath of laughter. "You're just saying that because you know how much I love Rocky." Rachel shot him a look. "I'm serious. Think about it. You're a struggling screenwriter, and suddenly, you're living in the house of an actor who made a career out of playing fighters and warriors. You hear a voice saying keep fighting, and I hear a laugh when you finally get your groove back. That's not a coincidence, Ethan." He had no argument for that. The conversation sat between them for the rest of the day, unspoken yet ever-present. Ethan tried to focus on his writing, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow move in his periphery. Rachel, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the old bookshelves in the living room. There were still a few things left behind from the previous owner, nothing valuable, just remnants of a life once lived. As she traced her fingers along the spines of the books, something caught her eye. One of the shelves didn't sit quite right. There was a small gap in the wood, as if it had been moved before. Curious, she pressed against it. A soft click. The panel shifted slightly under her touch. Rachel stepped back, heart hammering, as a section of the bookshelf swung open by an inch, just enough to reveal darkness beyond. Rachel's breath hitched as she stared at the narrow gap between the bookshelf and the wall. The air that seeped from the dark space beyond was cooler than the rest of the house, carrying with it the faint scent of aged paper and something older: wood, dust, time itself. For a long moment, she hesitated, one hand hovering over the edge of the bookshelf as if she expected it to slam shut on its own. "Ethan?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended. No response. He was still in his office. She swallowed hard, then pushed the shelf open further. It groaned against its hinges, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind the books. A small, windowless room lay beyond, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, though most were empty. A single chair sat against the far wall, its cushion flattened from years of use. And on the shelf nearest to her, stacked neatly as if someone had left them there for a reason, were several old VHS tapes. Rachel's fingers hovered over them. The spines were worn, their labels handwritten in neat, slanted script. She recognized some of the titles immediately: Rocky II, Action Jackson, Predator. But there were others that weren't movies. Auditions 1974. Boxing Training 1982. Behind the Scenes Private. Rachel's stomach flipped. These weren't just tapes. They were pieces of Carl Weathers' life, hidden away in a forgotten corner of the house. She carefully picked up the one labeled Auditions 1974, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real in a way that made the past feel closer than it should. Behind her, the air shifted, a whisper of movement, the barest rustle of sound. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply, but the room was empty. The doorway stood open, the hallway beyond stretching into the house's familiar warmth. Yet, for the first time since moving in, she felt as though she wasn't entirely alone. She forced herself to exhale. It was an old house. Drafts, creaks, settling wood, that's all it was. Still, when she stepped back into the light of the hallway, VHS tape clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just found something she wasn't meant to see. Ethan barely looked up when she entered his office, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The sound of typing filled the small room, rhythmic, steady. He hadn't written like this in months, maybe years. Rachel hesitated, glancing at the open document on his screen. It was a script, a fight scene from the looks of it. Two men in a dimly lit boxing gym, their breath coming in ragged gasps, one of them delivering a final, brutal punch. Felt familiar. Too familiar. "You're writing about him, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan paused, his fingers resting on the keys. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't have to. Rachel stepped forward, holding up the VHS tape. "I found this in a hidden room behind the bookshelf." That got his attention. He turned to her, eyebrows knitting together. "What?" "There's a room. Small, like a storage space. These were inside." She placed the tape carefully on his desk. "I think there's more." Ethan picked it up, running his thumb along the worn edge. His expression was unreadable, his mind clearly working through the implications. "Do we even have a way to play this?" Rachel hesitated. "Maybe. There's an old VCR in the living room cabinet. It was here when we moved in." Ethan didn't need any more convincing. They moved quickly, neither of them saying much as Rachel dug through the cabinet, pushing aside old instruction manuals and tangled cords until her fingers brushed against the hard plastic of the VCR. It was heavier than she remembered, covered in a fine layer of dust. But when she plugged it into the TV, the power light flickered on. Ethan inserted the tape. The machine whirred softly, swallowing it with the mechanical clunk of outdated technology. Then the screen flickered, static at first, white noise humming through the speakers. Then, a dimly lit room. A younger Carl Weathers sat in a chair, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. His expression was serious, focused. He looked like he was waiting for something. A voice off-screen spoke. "State your name." Carl straightened. His jaw tightened for a brief second before he answered. "Carl Weathers." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the past playing on the screen. It was something else, something watching. And somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces of the house, the faintest echo of footsteps sounded from the second floor. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The image on the screen wavered, lines of static rippling through Carl Weathers' younger face as the tape adjusted. The grainy quality of the recording made the scene feel unreal, like something half-remembered from a dream. Yet, the man in the frame was unmistakably alive in that moment, his eyes sharp, his presence commanding even in the simple audition setting. "Tell us about yourself," the off-screen voice prompted. Carl inhaled, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt, his muscles still defined even under the washed-out lighting. His face was serious but not cold. There was an energy beneath the surface, a quiet confidence waiting to be unleashed. "Well," he said, voice steady, "I played football for a while. Always had the drive for competition. But acting is a different kind of fight. You get knocked down a lot. People tell you no a lot. But that's part of it. You keep swinging. Rachel shivered. The room suddenly felt colder, as if something had shifted in the air. She glanced at Ethan, but he was transfixed, leaning forward on the couch. His fingers pressed against his lips as if he didn't want to make a sound. On screen, Carl straightened in his chair, rolling his shoulders slightly. The off-screen voice continued. "What do you bring to the table?" Carl smiled then. It wasn't just confidence, it was something deeper, something like certainty. "I bring the fight," he said simply. The tape flickered. For a moment, the image distorted, stretching unnaturally across the screen. The audio crackled. Then, darkness. Not static. Not the end of the tape. Just a black screen, as if the camera had stopped recording but the tape had kept running. The hum of white noise filled the silence. Ethan reached for the remote. Maybe it's damage. Then the black screen changed. A shape, a shadow shifting in the darkness. Rachel's breath hitched. It wasn't part of the original recording. The audition had been bright, sterile, professional. But this was different. The shape moved just slightly. It wasn't clear what they were looking at, but there was depth, something beyond the screen. And then, a sound. Not from the tape. From upstairs. A soft but deliberate thump. Rachel shot Ethan a look, her pulse spiking. He hesitated, remote still clutched in his hand, then stood abruptly. "I'll check it out," he said, though his voice held no conviction. Rachel followed, unwilling to be left alone with whatever was still playing on the screen. They stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet, but not the kind of silence that felt empty. It was full, weighted, like something was standing just out of sight, listening. Another noise. This time, the unmistakable sound of a footstep against hardwood. Came from the second floor. Ethan and Rachel exchanged a glance, then moved toward the stairs. The wood creaked beneath their feet as they climbed, every step slow, deliberate. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the faint glow from their bedroom nightlight. Everything looked normal, but the air was thick. Rachel's eyes darted toward the office. The door was open the way Ethan had left it. Then, something moved inside. Just a flicker, a shift of darkness. Rachel's heart pounded against her ribs. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. But Ethan had already seen it. He stepped forward, inching toward the door, his body tense, his breathing shallow. Rachel followed, her pulse hammering. The office was dark, the only illumination coming from the laptop screen still open, still glowing. But the chair was different. It had been turned, facing away from the desk, facing them. Ethan's breath hitched. The chair moved. Not much, just a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. But enough to send ice down Rachel's spine. Ethan reached for the light switch. Before he could flip it, a voice, low, quiet, right beside them. "Still got it," Rachel screamed. The lights snapped on. The room was empty. The room stood still in the harsh glow of the ceiling light, empty except for the chair that had undeniably moved. Ethan's breath came in short gasps, his pulse drumming in his ears. Rachel clutched the doorframe, her fingers digging into the wood, eyes wide and unblinking. Neither of them spoke. The air in the office felt different now, not cold, not menacing, but charged, like the final moments before a fight. Ethan took a slow step forward. The chair sat motionless in the center of the room, its back still angled toward them, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago. He reached out, heart hammering, and turned it back toward the desk. Nothing. The laptop screen blinked sleepily. The script he had been working on was still open. But something was different. A new line had appeared, just beneath the last sentence he had written. It hadn't been there before. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind struggling to accept what he was seeing. 3 simple words, typed in a steady, unhurried hand. "Keep punching, kid." Ethan staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. Rachel saw it too, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then, as if the house itself had exhaled, the heaviness in the air lifted. The charged silence faded, leaving only the familiar hum of the city outside. Ethan let out a slow breath, his muscles relaxing one by one. He glanced at Rachel, who still hadn't taken her eyes off the screen. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. Do you think he's still here?" Ethan swallowed, looking around the office, at the chair, at the desk, at the blinking cursor on the screen. He nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think he is." And for the first time since moving into the house, the thought didn't scare him. It made him smile. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.